The night was bitterly cold, with a sharp wind cutting through the quiet streets of Cedar Ridge, a small American town where everyone knew their neighbors. Most residents were asleep, nestled safely in their homes, but amid the darkness, a faint, desperate sound echoed through the narrow alley behind Grover's diner. A stray dog, scavenging for scraps, lifted its head at the sound of the whimpering and padded closer to investigate. There, tucked inside a worn-out blanket, was a tiny newborn baby boy, his face red from the cold, his cries weak but persistent. His tiny fists clenched against the frigid air, his innocent eyes unaware of the cruel fate that had befallen him. It wasn't long before someone heard the baby's cries. Jenna Brooks, a waitress finishing her late shift at Grover's, was about to lock up when she heard the faint whimpering. Frowning, she pulled her coat tighter around herself and cautiously stepped into the alley. Her heart clenched at the sight. "Oh my God," she breathed, dropping to her knees. Carefully, she unwrapped the blanket, revealing the helpless child within. His lips were trembling, his tiny chest rising and falling rapidly as he fought against the cold. Jenna's maternal instincts kicked in immediately. She scooped him up, pressing him against her warm body. "Shoo, sweetheart. I got you," she murmured, shielding him from the wind as she rushed back inside the diner. As soon as she entered, she grabbed her phone and dialed 911. 911, what's your emergency?" a calm voice responded. I just found a newborn baby abandoned in the alley behind Grover's diner. He's freezing, please send help." "Ma'am, stay where you are. An ambulance is on the way." Jenna held the baby close, rocking him gently as she waited. She had no idea who had left him there or why, but one thing was certain: someone had abandoned this little boy to die. And she wasn't about to let that happen. Little did she know, this was just the beginning of a mystery that would shake the town of Cedar Ridge to its core. The ambulance arrived within minutes, its sirens cutting through the quiet night. Paramedics rushed inside Grover's diner, their expressions shifting from urgency to heartbreak when they saw the tiny, shivering infant cradled in Jenna's arms. "He was left in the alley," Jenna explained quickly, her voice trembling with emotion. "I don't know how long he was out there." One of the paramedics, a kind-looking woman named Laura, reached for the baby. "You did the right thing calling us," she assured Jenna as she carefully took the newborn into her gloved hands. "We'll get him warmed up and checked out at the hospital." Jenna hesitated before letting go. She had only held the child for minutes, yet an attachment had already begun forming. "What will happen to him?" she asked as the paramedics placed the baby inside a temperature-controlled incubator in the ambulance. "He'll be put into protective care while the authorities investigate," Laura replied. "The police will be looking for the mother." Jenna watched as the ambulance sped away, a heavy weight settling in her chest. Who could abandon a child like that? And why? By morning, the entire town of Cedar Ridge was buzzing with the news. The diner filled up with curious customers, all murmuring about the alley baby. Some speculated the mother was a teenage girl too scared to raise him. Others whispered about more sinister possibilities: a crime, a desperate escape, or an unwanted pregnancy hidden in secrecy. Sheriff Thomas Grady stopped by the diner that afternoon, his usual tough demeanor tinged with concern. "Jenna, I need you to come down to the station and give a statement," he said, tipping his hat. "Of course," she replied without hesitation. At the station, Jenna recounted everything: the baby's cries, the freezing cold, the abandoned blanket. "Did you see anyone else around?" Sheriff Grady asked, jotting down notes. "No, just the baby. Whoever left him there was long gone." The sheriff sighed and leaned back in his chair. "We've got our guys looking at security footage from the nearby gas station and the grocery store across the street. We're hoping we'll catch something." Jenna felt a lump in her throat. "Do you think they'll find the mother?" "We always do," the sheriff said grimly. Meanwhile, at the Cedar Ridge Hospital, doctors and nurses worked to stabilize the baby. They estimated he had been born just hours before he was abandoned. His tiny body was dangerously close to hypothermia, but with care, he would recover. As he lay sleeping in the neonatal unit, an officer arrived with a request. "We need a DNA sample." And that single request would soon unravel a shocking truth no one in Cedar Ridge was prepared for. At Cedar Ridge Hospital, the newborn baby, now affectionately referred to by nurses as Little John, until a real name was found, slept peacefully under warm lights in the neonatal care unit. His vitals had stabilized, and aside from exposure to the cold, he was in surprisingly good health. But the mystery surrounding his abandonment only deepened. Sheriff Grady had assigned one of his officers, Detective Mark Reynolds, to oversee the case. The first step was simple: run a DNA test through the national database. It was a routine procedure in cases like this, usually to check for matches with missing persons or known relatives. A hospital nurse gently swabbed the baby's tiny cheek, sealing the sample in a sterile tube. The detective took it, thanking her before heading back to the station. "Run this immediately," Reynolds instructed a lab technician at the forensic department. "It'll take a couple of days," the technician warned. "But if the mother or father has any criminal record or if they've taken any DNA tests before, we might get a hit." Reynolds nodded, though he wasn't hopeful. More often than not, abandoned babies were left behind by frightened young mothers who had never interacted with law enforcement or genetic databases. Still, they had other leads. The sheriff and his team spent the next day combing through security footage from businesses near Grover's Diner. At first, nothing stood out, just ordinary people going about their night. But then, at 11:42 p.m., barely 20 minutes before Jenna had found the baby, the grainy footage from a gas station camera captured something chilling. A dark-colored sedan pulled up near the alley. A figure, hooded and dressed in black, stepped out with a bundle in their arms. They hesitated for several moments before disappearing into the shadows. Less than a minute later, they returned, now empty-handed, and drove off. "Can we get a plate?" Sheriff Grady asked, his eyes fixed on the screen. "Too dark," the technician said, squinting. "But I can enhance it." While the tech worked on enhancing the footage, the sheriff made a quiet decision. They would find this car and they would find out who had abandoned that child. But little did they know, the DNA test results were about to reveal something even more shocking, something that would turn the entire investigation on its head. 2 days later, the DNA results came back and Detective Mark Reynolds was the first to see them. He expected a standard report, either no matches or a distant relative. What he got instead sent a chill down his spine. The baby's DNA matched someone in the system. But it wasn't the mother. It wasn't even the father. The match was a man named William Hensley, a wealthy businessman from Cedar Ridge. More specifically, the DNA test revealed that William Hensley was the baby's grandfather. Reynolds stared at the report in disbelief. This didn't make sense. William Hensley had 2 children, his son, David, and his daughter, Emily. If the baby was William's grandson, that meant either David or Emily was the baby's parent. "Sheriff," Reynolds called, rushing into Grady's office. "You need to see this." Grady took the report, reading it with growing astonishment. "William Hensley? The guy who owns half the businesses in town." "The same one," Reynolds confirmed. "Which means this baby was abandoned by someone in his own family." Sheriff Grady leaned back in his chair, rubbing his chin. "We need to pay Mr. Hensley a visit." Later that afternoon, Grady and Reynolds pulled up in front of Hensley Manor, a sprawling estate on the outskirts of Cedar Ridge. The property was grand, surrounded by acres of manicured land and a wrought iron gate. A butler answered the door, but before he could speak, a deep voice called from inside. "It's all right, let them in." William Hensley stood at the entrance of his luxurious home, dressed in a tailored suit despite being at home. He was in his early 60s, but his presence was commanding. "Sheriff Grady," he said, shaking his hand firmly. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Grady didn't waste time. "Mr. Hensley, we need to talk about a newborn baby that was abandoned behind Grover's Diner 2 nights ago." Hensley's face barely changed, but there was a flicker of something in his sharp blue eyes. "What does that have to do with me?" he asked. Reynolds handed him a copy of the DNA report. "The baby is your grandson." For the first time, William Hensley's composure cracked. His fingers tightened around the paper, his jaw clenching. This has to be a mistake." "It's not," Reynolds said. "Either your son, David, or your daughter, Emily, is the parent of this child." Silence filled the grand foyer. Finally, William exhaled, shaking his head. "Emily is in Europe. She's been there for 6 months. That only leaves David," the sheriff finished. A storm of emotions passed over William's face: shock, anger, disbelief. Then, without another word, he turned and called out, "David, get down here, now." A few moments later, heavy footsteps echoed from the grand staircase, and David Hensley appeared, a tall, broad-shouldered man in his late 20s. His expression was unreadable as he took in the scene. "What's going on?" he asked. His father didn't answer. Instead, Sheriff Grady dropped the bombshell. "We have reason to believe you're the father of the abandoned newborn baby found 2 nights ago." David's face went pale. And then, without saying a word, he turned and bolted for the back door. "Stop right there, David." Sheriff Grady barked as David Hensley bolted toward the back of the estate. Reynolds was the first to react, sprinting after him. David, fueled by sheer panic, leaped over the patio railing and tore through the well-manicured backyard, heading toward the wooded area behind the estate. Reynolds was fast, but David was faster. He was younger, more agile, and clearly determined to escape. But he made a mistake. He glanced back. That brief second of distraction was all Reynolds needed. The detective lunged, tackling David to the ground. They hit the grass hard, rolling once before Reynolds managed to pin him down. "Get off me!" David growled, struggling beneath Reynolds' grip. "Then stop running," Reynolds snapped back. "Guilty people run. Innocent people talk." Sheriff Grady jogged up, breathing heavily. "That was real stupid, son." David stopped struggling, his chest rising and falling rapidly. His eyes darted between the two officers, realization sinking in. I didn't abandon him," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. Grady and Reynolds exchanged glances. "Then who did?" Grady asked. David swallowed hard. He was shaking now, not from exertion, but from something deeper. "Her name is Lena Carter," he confessed. "She's the baby's mother." The name sent a jolt through Sheriff Grady. He knew that name. Everyone in Cedar Ridge did. Lena Carter had been David's high school sweetheart. A local girl from a modest family, she had dated David on and off for years. But after graduating, she had seemingly vanished from town. And now David was telling them she had returned just long enough to have his child and abandon him? "Where is she now?" Reynolds demanded. David looked down, his jaw tightening. I don't know." Grady crossed his arms. "You better start talking, son. Because right now, things aren't looking good for you." David let out a shaky breath. "Lena showed up a few months ago, pregnant. She told me the baby was mine, but my father, he hesitated. He told me she was lying. That she was just trying to trap me into marrying her. He said we needed a paternity test before we did anything." Grady's frown deepened. William Hensley had a history of controlling his children's lives. "Lena was due soon, but my father refused to let me acknowledge the baby until we had proof," David continued. "She begged me to stand by her, but he stopped, guilt flashing across his face. I hesitated. And then one day she just disappeared." Grady narrowed his eyes. "And 2 nights ago she came back long enough to abandon your son?" David's voice cracked. "I don't know why she did it, Sheriff. But if Lena was desperate enough to leave him there, then something terrible must have happened." Reynolds and Grady shared another look. This was bigger than they had expected. David wasn't just a scared father trying to cover up a mistake. There was more to the story, and Lena Carter might be in danger. David Hensley sat on the edge of a chair in the Cedar Ridge police station, his hands locked together, his body stiff. He had agreed to come voluntarily, but he was still visibly shaken. Sheriff Grady and Detective Reynolds stood nearby, exchanging quiet words. "If Lena Carter abandoned the baby, why hasn't she come forward?" Reynolds murmured. "A mother doesn't just leave her child and disappear unless something's really wrong." "She might be in trouble," Grady said. "Or worse." They turned back to David. "You said Lena vanished a few months ago. Did she say anything about where she was staying?" Grady asked. David shook his head. "No. She wouldn't tell me. She just said she wasn't safe." Grady leaned forward. "Not safe from who?" "You? Your father." David's head snapped up, eyes blazing with anger. "I would never hurt her. And I don't think my father would either. He wanted her gone, yeah, but not like this." Grady exhaled. There was only one way to get to the truth. "We need to find her," he said firmly. Reynolds walked over to his desk and pulled up Lena Carter's last known address. It was an old apartment complex on the outskirts of town. The records showed she had moved in 6 months ago, but something was off. She had stopped paying rent 2 months ago. "That means she's either hiding somewhere else," Reynolds said, "or someone made her disappear." Grady grabbed his coat. "Let's go." Lena's apartment was in a rundown complex with flickering streetlights and peeling paint. When Grady and Reynolds knocked, there was no answer. "Landlord?" Grady asked, looking around. An older man, dressed in an old flannel shirt and jeans, appeared from behind the building, a cigarette hanging from his lips. "Y'all looking for Lena?" he asked. Grady nodded. "When was the last time you saw her?" The landlord exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "Maybe 2 months ago? She left in a hurry." "Didn't say why? Did she leave with anyone?" The landlord hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah. Some big guy in a suit. Never seen him before, but he didn't look friendly." Grady and Reynolds exchanged a glance. "A big guy in a suit? That sounded like someone from William Hensley's world." "We need to get inside," Reynolds said. The landlord pulled out a key. "Suit yourself. Just be careful, place is a mess. Inside, the apartment was dark and eerily quiet. Dust coated the furniture and a faint musty smell hung in the air. But then Reynolds noticed something, a stack of unopened mail on the counter addressed to Lena Carter. Bills, letters, eviction notices, but no signs of her actually packing up and leaving. She left in a hurry, Reynolds muttered. Maybe not by choice. Grady moved toward the bedroom, then stopped. The closet door was slightly open. He pulled it wider, and his stomach dropped. Inside, scattered on the floor, were baby clothes and a hospital discharge bracelet. Reynolds, he called. The detective hurried over. The bracelet had a name on it. Baby boy Carter. She had given birth here. And then she vanished. Grady's voice was grim. We're not just looking for a runaway mother. Reynolds nodded. We might be looking for a missing person. Sheriff Grady and Detective Reynolds drove in silence, the weight of the case pressing down on them. Lena Carter hadn't just abandoned her child, she had disappeared. And if the landlord was telling the truth, she hadn't left willingly. There was only one person in Cedar Ridge powerful enough to make someone disappear. William Hensley. We need to talk to him again, Reynolds said, gripping the wheel. Grady nodded. And this time, we don't take, I don't know, for an answer. Back at Hensley Manor, William Hensley sat calmly in his study, sipping a glass of whiskey as if he wasn't at the center of a missing person investigation. You're back so soon, Sheriff, he said coolly, setting his glass down. Grady didn't waste time. Where's Lena Carter? William barely blinked. How should I know? You had her taken, Reynolds accused. We have a witness who saw a man in a suit force her out of her apartment. Someone with power. Someone like you. A flicker of irritation crossed William's face, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. Detective, I assure you, I don't waste my time on girls like Lena Carter. But you did, didn't you? Grady pressed. You didn't want her around your son. You didn't want her to ruin your legacy. So what did you do? William exhaled, swirling the whiskey in his glass. I merely suggested she leave. Reynolds narrowed his eyes. Suggested? Or forced? I did what any father would do, William said smoothly. I made her an offer to disappear from my son's life. A generous one. Grady's jaw clenched. And if she refused? William finally smiled, a cold, knowing smile. Then I ensured she accepted. The room went silent. Where's she, William? Grady asked, his voice dangerously low. William leaned back, his expression unreadable. That, Sheriff, is for you to find out. It took another day of digging, but finally, Reynolds and Grady found what they were looking for, a property owned by the Hensleys just outside of town. An abandoned cabin deep in the woods. When they arrived, the front door was chained shut. Grady kicked it open. Inside, Lena Carter lay on a thin mattress, weak but alive. Her wrists were bruised, her lips dry. When she saw them, she barely managed a whisper. You found me. Reynolds rushed to her side. We're getting you out of here. Lena trembled as tears filled her eyes. He locked me away. He said if I ever tried to come back, he'd take my baby and make sure I never saw him again. Grady clenched his fists. William Hensley? Lena nodded. He made sure I had no choice. He took my phone, my money, everything. I had no way to reach David. No way to ask for help. Reynolds' voice was sharp. And the baby? Why did you leave him? Lena sobbed. Because I thought someone would find him and save him. I didn't want him growing up in that family. I didn't want him raised by a man like William Hensley. Grady and Reynolds exchanged glances. The pieces finally made sense. Lena hadn't abandoned her baby. She had been running for her life. 1 week later, William Hensley was arrested for kidnapping and unlawful imprisonment. The town of Cedar Ridge erupted in shock as his empire began to crumble. David Hensley, shaken and furious, cut ties with his father and swore to be the father his son deserved. And Lena Carter? She was finally free, holding her baby boy in her arms, knowing that she had survived the nightmare. Her son would grow up safe, loved, and far away from the shadow of the Hensleys. And justice had finally been served.